She was 17 years old, and she owned $11. Not 12, not 10, 11, counted out in coin across a kitchen table by a man who did not raise his voice, did not meet her eyes, and did not consider the matter worth a second thought once the coins had stopped ringing against the wood. She owned $11, a canvas satchel with 2 changes of clothing, and a brass surveyor's level wrapped in oilcloth that had belonged to her grandfather, and in 4 days' time she would stand at the base of a mountain that every soul within 40 miles had already agreed was cursed, worthless, and unfit for anything but the burying of old mining debts. They called it Widow's Ice. She did not yet know why. She did not yet know that beneath the gray scar of a rock slide that had buried the upper slope some 11 winters before, there was water moving, patient, cold, and hidden, the way her grandfather had taught her all water eventually reveals itself to those who know how to look for the low places, the green places, the places where frost forms last and melts first. She did not know that in 1 year's time, a widow and 3 starving children would walk up that same frozen slope and find, instead of a curse, a home with terraced fields cut clean into the south-facing rock, fed by a spring nobody else had thought to search for. But that comes later. Settle in, if you will, wherever you are watching this from. Tell me the town, tell me the season where you sit, because this is a long walk, and it deserves to be walked slowly, the way she walked it. It begins, as these things often do, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, with a signature and a folded paper, and a woman who did not consider herself cruel, only careful with money, that was no longer, by any account, obligated to her. But to understand what she carried in that satchel, and why a brass instrument no heavier than a loaf of bread would matter more than any inheritance of land or coin, you have to go back further than that morning. You have to go back to a smaller house and a slower time, when a man with flower-white hands and patient eyes would kneel beside a girl no taller than his hip and show her how to read the tilt of a hillside the way other men read scripture. That is where this story truly starts, not with the leaving, with the teaching that made the leaving survivable. The house sat at the edge of a valley in the territory, built low against the wind, with a stone chimney her grandfather had laid himself, 1 rock at a time, over the course of a summer she was too young to remember, but old enough to have heard about 100 times since. He was a surveyor by trade, though by the time she knew him his instruments had mostly gone quiet, packed in a case lined with green felt gone thin at the corners, brought out only on Sundays, or on the evenings when the light lay long and gold across the fields, and he wanted, as he put it, to see how the ground was lying to him that week. He was not a sentimental man in his words. He was sentimental in his patience, which is a rarer thing and lasts longer. He would carry her out past the fence line, her small hand swallowed in his, and set her down on a rise of ground, and ask her what she saw. She would say grass. He would say look again. He would crouch beside her, his knees popping in the quiet, and point to the way the grass leaned, the way water had once run, and left its memory, in a shallow groove no wider than a wagon rut, the way a stand of cottonwoods, 3/4 of a mile off told you, before you ever walked there, that the ground beneath them held moisture no map would mark. Ground remembers, he told her. Most men just never learn its language. He taught her to set a level on a tripod leg by leg, to read the bubble drift left or right, to understand that the land she stood on was never as flat as it pretended to be, that every slope carried a story about where water had gone and where it might be persuaded to go again. He taught her the names of rock, shale that crumbled like old bread, granite that held its shape through 100 winters, limestone that dissolved slow and quiet and left caves a man could lose himself in. He taught her that snow was not simply cold, that it lay differently on ground that hid a spring beneath it, that it thinned and grayed and sank in patterns a careless eye would walk straight past without ever wondering why. She did not know, in those years, that she was being given a trade. She thought only that these were the hours she loved best, kneeling beside a man whose hands smelled of pipe tobacco and machine oil, whose voice never rose, who never once told her a thing was too difficult for a girl to hold in her mind. She did not know, either, that the hours were numbered, that patience, however deep, cannot outlast a failing heart forever, and that soon enough there would come a winter when the felt-lined case would sit closed on its shelf, waiting for hands smaller than his to open it again. The winter, it happened, arrived the way most true endings arrive, without ceremony, without the courtesy of warning. He had complained of nothing more than a tiredness in his shoulders, a heaviness he blamed on the cold, on his age, on nothing in particular. He went to bed early on a Thursday in December and did not rise on Friday, and she remembered afterward, with the strange precision grief lends to small useless facts, that the thermometer nailed outside the kitchen window had read 11 degrees, and that the well had frozen solid 2 days before, and that she had been the one to break the ice with the flat of an axe that very morning, not knowing it was the last morning that would matter for a long while. There was no long illness to prepare her, no gradual fading a girl might grow used to. There was a man who had taught her the names of rock, and then there was absence, sudden and complete, the felt-lined case sitting closed on its shelf exactly where he had left it, waiting for hands that were, in that first raw week, too numb with sorrow to lift the lid at all. It was 3 days before she opened it. She remembered sitting on the floor of the room that had been his, the narrow bed still made, the pipe still resting in its dish of ash, and drawing the case into her lap the way she might have drawn a smaller child, and unlatching the 2 brass hooks with fingers that would not stop trembling. Inside, nestled in a bed of green felt gone soft with decades of handling, lay the surveyor's level, its brass barrel dulled to the color of old honey, its bubble vial clouded faintly with age, but still true, still capable of finding level ground the way it had found it for him across 40 years of work before the pipe and the porch chair and the girl at his knee had become his whole occupation. There was a note tucked beneath it, written in the cramped, deliberate hand of a man who had never trusted his penmanship. It said only that the instrument was hers now, that she was to keep it level and keep it clean, and never let anyone tell her it was too fine a thing for a girl to carry, and that the ground, wherever she found herself standing on it, would always tell her the truth if she was patient enough to ask it properly. She did not cry reading it. She had already cried what tears seemed available to her, in the days prior, in the barn, in the cold. She only closed the case again, carefully, the way he had always closed it, and set it beneath her own narrow bed, and went on with the chores because the animals did not know a man had died, and would not forgive her for forgetting them on account of it. She did not yet know how soon she would need every lesson he had given her, nor how little time remained before the house itself, and everything in it, would no longer be considered hers to keep. The 7 weeks that followed her grandfather's burial moved with a strange double motion, slow in the mornings and fast toward dusk, the way grief tends to warp a calendar until the person living inside it can no longer say with certainty whether a thing happened yesterday or a month before. She kept the house. She kept the animals. She kept, most of all, the habit he had drilled into her without ever calling it a lesson, the habit of walking the fence line every 3rd morning with her eyes down, reading the frost heave and the settling soil the way another girl might read a letter, noting where the ground had shifted, where water pooled and should not have, where a post had begun its slow lean toward collapse. She did this not because anyone asked it of her, but because stopping felt, to her, like a second kind of burial. Her uncle by marriage, her mother's sister's husband, a man of ledgers and quiet arithmetic, named for no one in particular in this telling because names were never his currency, only sums, arrived on the 11th of March with a satchel of papers and a manner so composed it was almost restful to be near, the way the cold itself can be restful once a person has stopped fighting it. He did not raise his voice. He did not once suggest that her grief was an inconvenience, though it plainly was one to the schedule he kept in his head. He walked the property with her in a silence she mistook, for the first hour, as respect. It was not respect. It was assessment. By the 2nd day he had totaled the worth of the house, the stock, the tools, the debts her grandfather had left unpaid to a feed merchant 2 counties over, and the smaller debts owed in turn to her grandfather by men who would not now be pressed to honor them, out of what he called, without irony, prudence. He explained all of this to her at the kitchen table, the ledger open between them like a hymnal, his finger moving down a column of figures with the patience of a man teaching a child her letters. He did not once look up to see whether she was following. He assumed, correctly, that she was. When he reached the bottom of the page, he set down his pen and folded his hands, and told her, in the same unhurried voice he had used for the debts and the stock and the feed merchant, that the house could not keep two households, that her keep had been accounted for through the winter as her grandfather would have wished, and that beyond it there remained a sum belonging to her outright, which he had already counted twice to be certain of its accuracy. He did not say the sum aloud yet. He turned the ledger toward her instead, so that she might read the figure for herself, in his own careful hand, and know that no one had cheated her of a single cent. She looked down at the figure, the way she had once looked down at a column of survey numbers her grandfather had left unfinished on purpose, to see whether she could carry it forward herself. $11, written twice, once in the running total, and once beneath it, underlined, as though the underlining might make the sum weigh more than it did. She did not ask him to explain the arithmetic. She had watched him build it line by line, and she trusted, the way she trusted a plumb bob, that it had been done honestly, which was its own kind of cruelty, because there was no dishonesty in it to be angry at. Only a widower's prudence, applied to a girl the same as it was applied to a debt owed the feed merchant. He asked, still without heat, whether she understood. She said that she did. He seemed relieved by this, in the mild way a man is relieved when a fence post sets true on the first try, and he closed the ledger and did not open it again. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that her grandfather's claim up past the western switchbacks, the frozen ground the county called Widow's Ice, the ground no one had worked in 9 years, had reverted to her, by the terms of the old filing, since no one else had troubled to contest it. He said this the way a man mentions that a barn owl has taken up in the loft, a fact of small consequence, worth noting once and then setting aside. He did not think the claim was worth the paper it was recorded on. He said so plainly, not to wound her, but because he believed it, and because he had never once in 9 years walked the ground himself to find out otherwise. She asked him to repeat the name of the claim, and he did, without curiosity as to why she wanted it repeated. Widow's Ice. He spelled it for her when she asked that too, in the same patient tone he used for figures, and she understood that he assumed her interest was sentimental, the harmless attachment of a girl to a dead man's paper, and not anything a sensible person needed to account for in a ledger. He rose then, and drew $11 from a tin box kept behind the flour, counting it into her palm coin by coin and bill by bill, aloud, so that the counting itself stood as a kind of receipt. He did not offer to drive her anywhere. He said, as he had said of the debts and the stock, that arrangements had been made, and that a wagon bound west along the freight road would take her as far as the fork below the switchbacks for the price of the ride, if she cared to go that direction, though he could not think why she would. She folded the money into her palm, closed her hand around it, and did not tell him that she already knew exactly why. She left the house before he could think of anything further to say, because there was nothing further for him to say, and because standing in his presence a moment longer would have required her to arrange her face into gratitude she did not feel and could not counterfeit. Outside, the morning had gone the color of skimmed milk, the sun, not yet risen above the ridge but announcing itself in a pale seam along the east, and she stood on the porch board that always creaked under the third step and let the cold settle into her, the way she had once let her grandfather's silences settle into her, as instruction rather than absence. $11. She had counted it herself, once more, in the dark of the barn where she had gone to collect the level and the canvas roll of chains, and had found the sum exact, not a cent added for kindness, not a cent withheld for spite, which told her more about the nature of the arrangement than any speech could have. The wagon she had heard mentioned was already loading at the crossroads by the time she walked there, her satchel over one shoulder, and the level's case, slung against her hip where it knocked her thigh with each stride, a small hard reminder that she was not walking away from anything so much as walking toward it. The freighter was a heavy man with a face burned the color of harness leather, and he looked at her the way men look at cargo they have not been told the weight of, then shrugged, and told her the fork below the switchbacks would cost her 40 cents, payable now, and she paid it without argument, because argument was a currency she could no longer afford to spend. The road west ran through country she had seen only from a distance her whole life. Low hills giving way to higher ones, the grass thinning, the air growing a degree colder with every mile, as though the land itself were counting down toward the place she was bound. She rode among crates of tinned goods and coils of rope, her knees drawn up, the level's case held flat across her lap like something that might spill if tipped, and she watched the country change without speaking to the two other passengers, a drummer with a case of tonics and an old woman going to nurse a daughter's confinement, both of whom eyed her satchel and her plain dress, and drew their own conclusions and kept them to themselves. By dusk the grass had stopped altogether. By the second morning there was frost on the wagon rail that did not melt until nearly noon, and the driver pointed with his chin toward a notch in the mountains ahead, blue-shadowed and silent, and said that was the fork, and beyond it, the road they called the Switchbacks, and beyond that he did not go, nor did most men, nor should she, if she had good sense. She did not answer him, not out of rudeness, but because there was nothing in her to say that would have changed the shape of what lay ahead, and she had learned early, in the years of watching her grandfather work, that a man who announces his fear only invites more of it. She paid what remained of her $11 down to $4 for the last leg, a mule and a boy of perhaps 14, who knew the switchbacks by memory rather than by sign, since there were no signs, only a game trail widened by generations of use and disuse, climbing along a shoulder of rock with a drop on one side that she made a point of not measuring with her eyes. The boy did not speak either, which suited her, and the mule picked its way with the patient contempt of an animal that had done this 100 times and expected to do it 100 more, indifferent to the cold sweat on her palms, or the way she gripped the level's case against her chest, as if it were the only ballast keeping her from going over. The air thinned and sharpened. Pine gave way to spruce, and spruce thinned in turn to wind-stunted trees bent all one direction like men leaning away from a blow, and then to no trees at all, only rock and old snow lying in the shadowed folds where the sun did not reach even at midday. Twice they crossed places where the trail had been carried away and rebuilt with logs laid crosswise and packed with gravel, and twice the boy dismounted and led the mule over on foot, and twice she did the same, her boots finding the give of half-rotted wood beneath the gravel and not liking it. She began, without meaning to read the slope the way her grandfather had taught her to read a survey line, where the water had run, where it still ran beneath the surface, where the rock had shifted, and where it had held, and the reading told her things she did not want to know, that this whole shoulder of mountain had come down once already, long before her boots ever touched it, and might again. By the time the boy pointed ahead and said, without inflection, "That was Widow's Ice," the sun was low and orange and throwing long blue shadows across a basin she could not yet properly see, walled in on 3 sides by rock the color of an old bruise, and she understood, looking at it, why a man might sign a paper giving away such a place without regret, and why another man, patient and quiet and dead 3 years now, might have looked at the same ground and seen something else entirely. The boy did not linger. He untied her single trunk from the mule's back, set it down in the dust with the same flat courtesy he had shown all morning, and told her the claim office had already recorded the transfer, that the papers were done, that there was nothing more for him to do here. She asked him, because she could not help herself, whether anyone had lived in the basin within his memory. He said a family had tried, once, before the second slide, and that afterward, no one had wanted the trouble of it. He did not say what became of the family. She did not ask. Some silences, her grandfather used to say, are answers dressed as manners, and she had learned to leave those alone. When the mule's hoofbeats had faded back down the trail, and the light had gone from orange to the deep blue-gray that comes just before true dark, she stood alone at the edge of what was hers, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she allowed herself to simply look. The basin lay below her like a bowl someone had forgotten to empty, floored in old snow gone gray and granular, ringed by rock that had clearly moved and clearly might move again, and at its center a tangle of broken timber that had once, she supposed, been a cabin, half swallowed now by the same slide that had made the place a name to avoid rather than a home to keep. She counted, out of old habit, the number of things that were wrong with it, the pitch of the slope, the exposure to the north wind, the way the rock walls funneled sound, so that even now, standing still, she could hear water somewhere she could not see. That last thing she did not dismiss. Water she could not see was, her grandfather had told her more than once, more interesting than water she could. She set down her satchel, unwrapped the brass level with hands that had gone stiff from the cold, and knelt in the failing light to do the only thing she knew how to do with any real confidence in the world, to read the ground the way it wanted to be read, not the way its reputation said it should be read. She sighted along the level toward the buried timbers, then toward the low place where the snow lay darker and denser than elsewhere, then toward the seam in the rock wall where a faint dampness caught what light was left. She did this 3 times, slowly, the way she had been taught, because a single sighting could lie but 3 in agreement rarely did. By full dark, she had not solved anything, but she had found, marked faintly in her own memory, the way her grandfather had once marked a survey book, 3 points that did not belong to a cursed and broken slope, 3 points that belonged, instead, to a question worth asking again in daylight. She did not sleep so much as wait out the night beside it, wrapped in the wool blanket that had been her mother's, listening to the mountain make its small sounds, the tick of cooling rock, the occasional soft collapse of snow settling somewhere above her, the wind combing through the broken timbers like fingers through hair. She kept the level close against her side, the brass gone cold as a river stone, and she found herself thinking not of curses or of the men who had laughed when the claim passed to her, but of her grandfather's voice explaining why a man should never trust a single sighting, why the ground would tell a different story depending on the hour, the light, the temperature of the air. Ground lies in the morning and lies in the evening, he had said, but it tells the truth twice a day, right at the seams of things. She did not know, lying there, whether she believed the ground could tell the truth about anything. She only knew she intended to be awake when it tried. Dawn came gray and reluctant, the sun a pale coin behind cloud, and she was up before the light had fully committed itself to the sky. She ate a strip of dried meat, standing, because sitting felt like a luxury she had not earned, and she carried the level back to the seam in the rock wall where the dampness had shown itself the night before. In daylight it was less than she remembered and more than she had hoped, a hairline of moisture no wider than a knife blade, but it had not frozen, not even in air that stung the inside of her nose with every breath. She touched it with one bare finger and felt, distinctly, a temperature that did not belong to a mountain in the grip of winter. She moved next to the low place where the snow had lain dark and dense, and she began, without deciding to begin, the slow work of clearing it, not digging so much as reading, the way her grandfather had taught her to read a drift before a spring flood, watching how it packed, how it resisted the shovel in some places and gave way in others, as though something beneath it were holding its shape on purpose. An hour in, her hands raw despite the gloves, she found the snow no longer white beneath the surface, but faintly stained, faintly darkened, the color of earth that has been wet a very long time. She sat back on her heels and looked at the level lying in the snow beside her, its brass dulled with cold, its glass vial catching what little sun there was, and she understood, with the particular quiet certainty her grandfather used to have when he was right about something no one else believed, that she was not looking at a curse at all. She was looking at the outline of water. She did not trust the certainty right away, because her grandfather had also taught her that the mountain punished people who trusted their first good feeling about it, and so she made herself set the level down properly. On a flat stone she tamped into place with the heel of her boot, and she watched the bubble settle before she let herself do anything else. The vial steadied, the line held true. Only then did she pick the shovel back up. The staining in the snow widened as she worked outward from the low place, not in a circle, but in a long, deliberate shape, narrow at the top of the slope, and broadening as it came down toward the flat where the cabin sat, and she recognized the shape before she understood it, because it was the shape of a wash, the shape water makes for itself over years when no one is there to argue with it. She followed it another 4 feet down and struck, not rock, but a kind of gray clay packed hard as brick, and beneath that clay, when she worked the shovel's edge under it, and levered upward with both hands and the whole weight of her back, a sound came up through the handle into her palms that was not the sound of stone. It was duller, it gave. She stopped and pressed her ear, absurdly, to the shovel's own handle, the way a child might press an ear to a wall, and told herself she was being foolish, and did it anyway. There was no sound to hear that way, of course. But when she straightened and looked down at the widening dark patch in the snow, she saw for the first time that steam was rising from it, thin as breath in the cold, curling up off the packed earth and vanishing before it rose higher than her knee. She had walked past that low place a dozen times since the first week of the thaw, and never once seen it steam, because she had never once cleared enough snow away at the right hour, in the right cold, to let it show itself. Her grandfather used to say that water always announces itself before it commits to anything, that it will tell a patient man where it means to go long before it goes there, in the tilt of moss, in the lean of grass, in the places frost is slow to bite and slower to leave. She had thought she understood what he meant. Kneeling now in the wet snow with her palms flat against ground that should have been frozen solid in the 4th month of a mountain winter, she understood that she had only understood it as an idea, the way a girl understands a story told at a fire, and that she was only now, for the first time, understanding it as a fact she could put her hands on. She began to dig faster. The snow came away in wet clumps under her bare fingers, heavier than powder, packed dense from months of settling, and she worked without gloves because gloves could not tell her what her skin could. The sudden change from bone cold to merely cold, the place where the ground gave up its grip on the frost. 6 inches down her nails struck gravel, small and rounded, river-worn stone that had no business sitting under a slope of broken granite, unless water had carried it there, and set it down the way water always does, patient and exact, sorting the world by weight while no one watched. She sat back on her heels and looked at the stones in her palm and thought of the ledger her grandfather kept in his head instead of on paper, the one that recorded which draws ran wet in a dry year and which ridges shed their snow first, and she understood that she was reading an entry in that ledger now, written in gravel instead of ink. She dug on. The steam thinned as the sun climbed and the cold eased, and she cursed under her breath at losing the 1 hour of the day the ground was willing to speak, then forced herself to slow down, to move the way he had taught her to move when a slope's temper mattered more than a man's hurry, testing each layer before committing to the next, feeling for the difference between snowmelt seeping sideways and something rising from beneath. At 2 feet the gravel gave way to a darker soil, black and faintly sweet-smelling even in the cold, soil that had never once frozen solid in a place where everything froze solid, and beneath that her fingers met water, not standing water. Moving water, cold enough to ache in the bone, but not cold enough to still, a thread of it no wider than her wrist, sliding sideways through the gravel bed, with the unhurried confidence of something that had been doing this for longer than the mountain had worn its current shape. She did not shout. She had no one to shout to. She knelt there with her hand in the current, and let it run over her knuckles until she could no longer feel her fingers, and thought, with a clarity that startled her more than the water itself, that a spring fed from below a rock slide meant a source higher up, that the slide had buried, but not killed, meant pressure enough to push through gravel and soil and half a mountain of broken stone without freezing solid in a winter that killed cattle standing in their own barns. It meant the ground had a heartbeat someone had assumed was long stopped. She sat back, soaked to the elbow, and looked up the slope toward the scar of pale rock, where the slide had come down, years before anyone now living could say for certain when, and understood that the true digging had not yet begun. She pulled her hand from the water and pressed it flat against her thigh, until the sting of cold turned to ache, and the ache turned to something she could work with. She counted the days in her head, the way her grandfather had taught her to count anything that mattered, not by feeling, but by number. 11 days since she had first climbed the slope with the level strapped across her back. 11 days of reading a mountain that had refused, so far, to say anything plain. Now it had said one thing plain. She rose, knees wet through her skirt, and began to walk the gravel bed upward, tracing the thread of water against its own logic, not where it was easiest to walk, but where the ground dipped a half inch, then rose, then dipped again, the way her grandfather had shown her water, always argued with slope, and always, eventually, won. She set the level down every 20 paces and sighted along it, the bubble sliding in its brass tube, and marked each reading in the small book she kept for the purpose, numbers only, no words, because words could lie to a tired mind, and numbers rarely did. By the fourth reading, she understood the slide had not simply buried a spring. It had buried a whole shelf of ground, a fold in the mountain that had once held water the way a cupped hand holds it, and the rock had come down across the mouth of that fold, like a door slammed shut by something that did not care what was living behind it. She stopped at a place where two boulders leaned together, forming a low dark gap she could not see the bottom of, and heard, faint as breathing, the sound of the water passing beneath her boots. She did not go in, not yet. She had promised herself, the first week on the claim, that she would not put herself into any hole in this mountain without first knowing where its other end led out, because a man 2 valleys over had done exactly that the winter she was 12, and had not come back out, and the story of him was still told at the trading post as a caution rather than a tragedy, which she had always found the colder of the two. Instead, she stood at the gap and pictured the level as her grandfather had used it on the Wyoming grade, not as a tool for looking at what already lay flat, but as a tool for finding what wanted to be made flat, what the land was already halfway toward becoming, if a person had the patience to finish the argument the water had started. She thought of the widow's cabin 2 miles down, the smoke thin and careful over its chimney, rationed like everything else that family owned. She closed the small book, tucked it inside her coat against her chest, where the cold could not easily reach it, and started back down the slope in the flattening light, already composing in her mind the shape of a ditch that did not yet exist, cut through ground no one else had believed was worth the shovel. The descent took longer than she expected, because twice she stopped to press her boot into patches of snow that looked ordinary and were not, testing for the give that meant water moving beneath, the way her grandfather had taught her to read a meadow in July, by the color of its grass alone. Darker green, in a crooked line, he used to say, is a river that forgot to come up for air. She found 2 such lines before she reached the tree cover, both running roughly toward the notch where the slide had opened its gap, and she marked each with a broken branch stood upright in the snow, a small, ugly flag that meant nothing to anyone but her. By the time she reached the cabin, the sky had gone the color of a bruise healing, purple going to yellow at its edges, and she did not light the lamp right away. She sat at the table with the level in front of her, turned the brass housing until the bubble found its center, and studied it as though it might answer a question she had not yet finished asking. 40 rods, she thought, perhaps 50, if the ground bent the way she suspected past the second flagged line. A ditch that shallow would freeze solid by the second week of the month, and a ditch that froze was worse than no ditch at all, because a person could look at bare ground and know to carry water by hand, but a person looking at ice in a ditch believed, wrongly, that the work was already done. She got up and pulled down the ledger her grandfather had kept on the Wyoming grade, the one she had carried with her wrapped in oilcloth since the day she left the account closed and the door shut behind her, and she paged through it by lamp until she found the entry she remembered, a note in his cramped hand about laying pipe below the frost line in a country not unlike this one, about the difference between a ditch that fought the winter and a ditch that went under it and let the winter pass overhead unbothered. Pipe, she thought, not a ditch at all, not up top where the wind could reach it, something buried, something that ran the water the way a mole ran a tunnel, blind and patient and untouched by what happened on the surface. She did not have pipe. She had no money for pipe, and no freight road within 2 days that would carry it if she had. What she had was hollowed cedar, and a saw, and a winter's worth of nothing to do but work, and a widow 2 miles off, whose children were thin, in a way that made her chest hurt to think about. She banked the fire, blew out the lamp, and lay awake a long while listening to the wind test the corners of the cabin, already counting in her head how many lengths of cedar a single tree might give her, and whether one winter was enough time to bury a river. She woke before light, the way she had woken every morning since her grandfather first put a level in her hands, and she did not reach for coffee before she reached for the ledger book he had left her, the one with the soft leather cover gone gray at the corners, and in it she began to draw. Not a drawing meant for beauty. A drawing meant for measurement. The slope of the south field stepped down in her memory, the way her legs had walked it 100 times that autumn, and beneath each step she marked a number, a rough guess at fall, at distance, at how far a length of hollowed cedar might carry water, before the grade betrayed it, and the flow either stalled or tore the joints apart. She spent 2 days only walking the ground with the level itself, setting it on its tripod legs in the frozen dirt, sighting through it the way she had been taught, before she was tall enough to reach the eyepiece without a stool beneath her, her grandfather's hand steadying the instrument, his voice low and unhurried. "Water does not care what you want," he used to say. "It only cares what you built." She thought of that sentence so often that winter, it stopped feeling like memory and started feeling like weather, something simply present in the air around her. The felling took longer than she expected. She chose the cedars nearest the spring itself, reasoning that dragging trunks a shorter distance mattered more than the ache in her arms, and she worked with the crosscut saw until her palms split and she wrapped them in strips of flour sacking and kept working anyway. Each log she quartered, then hollowed with a slow auger bit her grandfather had carried west in his toolbox for reasons she had never understood until now, boring through the pith again and again, until what remained was a rough pipe, uneven, splintered at the joints, but a pipe nonetheless, capable of carrying what the open ditch could not survive. She fitted the lengths with pitch and rawhide lashing, laid them below the frost line exactly as the letter had instructed. In a trench she dug with a mattock through ground so hard in places it rang like iron under the blade. The widow came by twice that week, not to help. Her hands were too raw already from her own labors, but to sit near the fire afterward and watch the girl eat, and once she said, without any particular emphasis, that she had never seen a person work like that for ground nobody else wanted. The girl only nodded because she was already thinking of the next joint, the next length, the next place the water might find a way to argue with her, and she intended, before the first thaw came looking for weakness, to have already won every one of those arguments underground, where nothing but the mountain would ever see it. The trench swallowed 4 days entire, and she counted them not by the sun, which barely cleared the ridgeline before sliding back into shadow, but by the blisters that rose and broke and rose again on the meat of her palms, calluses building over calluses the way her grandfather's had, though she had not known that until she caught herself holding the mattock the exact way he used to hold a shovel, wrists loose, letting the tool's weight do what her arms alone could not. She thought of him more in that trench than she had anywhere else on the claim, perhaps because the work itself was his, handed down the way some men handed down land or coin, and she understood now that this was the better inheritance, the one that could not be repossessed by any bank, or any cousin with a signed paper. On the 5th morning she reached the place where the pipe would meet the old rock slide's lowest seam, the spot the letter marked only with a small drawn triangle and the words, "Listen here before you dig." And she did listen, kneeling with her ear near the frozen ground the way he had taught her to listen to a horse's chest, for wind before a long ride, and she heard it, not water moving, not yet, but a hollowness beneath the stone, an absence where there should have been solid earth, the particular silence of a space that was waiting to be filled. She did not dig that day. She sat back on her heels in the cold and considered it the way he had taught her to consider any ground before disturbing it, turning the problem over slowly, because haste was the one debt the mountain never forgave. The widow's youngest, a boy of perhaps 6 with his mother's same wary quiet, had followed her out that morning without being asked, and now crouched a few feet off, watching her watch the ground, and when she finally spoke it was to him rather than to herself. "There's a room down there," she said, "not a room like a house has, a room water made for itself a long time before either of us was born." The boy asked, with the flat seriousness children bring to important questions, whether it was still down there or whether it had left. She did not answer right away. She picked up the mattock again, turned it over once in her raw hands, and looked at the seam in the rock where the pipe would go, where the pitch and rawhide and her grandfather's patient joinery would carry whatever answer the mountain gave. "We're about to find out," she said, and struck the first blow. The mattock bit into frozen gravel, with a sound like a door being asked a question it did not want to answer, and the boy flinched at the noise but did not run. She struck again, and again. The rhythm of it was old in her hands now, older than the year she had spent learning it, older than her grandfather's voice explaining why a blow delivered in anger only tired the arm, while a blow delivered in patience moved the earth. Frost broke away in flat chips. Beneath the frost, gravel the color of rust. Beneath the gravel, something darker, wetter, that did not chip so much as give. She stopped and knelt, and put her bare hand into the cut she had made. The cold there was a different cold than the air's cold. It had weight to it, a mineral heaviness, the kind of cold that comes off standing water rather than open sky. She held her hand there 3 full breaths, the way he had taught her to test a spring before trusting it, because a hand could read temperature faster than the eye could read color, and temperature did not lie the way color sometimes did. "Water," she said, "moving." The boy came a step closer despite himself. "Moving where?" he asked. She did not know yet, and told him so plainly, because her grandfather had never pretended certainty he did not have, and she had learned that a false confidence collapses faster than an honest doubt. She widened the cut another 6 inches, working the mattock at an angle now rather than square, feeling for the give in the ground the way a man feels for a rib beneath skin. The dark wet vein widened with her. It ran downslope, faintly, toward the terrace she had graded in autumn, which meant either the mountain had already been telling her the truth all along, and she had simply not dug deep enough to hear it, or the vein bent somewhere below and would betray her yet. She looked at the sky, gauging light the way she gauged everything now, out of habit rather than urgency. Perhaps 2 hours of good sun left, enough to open the seam another arm's length, not enough to lay pipe today, and laying pipe in poor light was the kind of mistake the mountain remembered for a season. She sat back on her heels again and wiped her palm on her skirt, leaving a dark smear there like a stain from something spilled rather than something found. "Fetch your mother," she told the boy. "Tell her we'll want the kettle and rags before dark, and tell her not to hope yet." The boy did not move at once. He was looking past her, down into the cut, where the water she had uncovered sat black and unmoving in its rocky cradle, waiting the way it must have waited every winter, for longer than anyone now living could account for. "Is it the same water," he asked, "as makes the garden grow?" She looked down into the seam a long moment before answering, because the honest answer was that she did not know, not with certainty, only with the kind of suspicion her grandfather had taught her to trust, and to test in equal measure. "We're about to find that out too," she said, and reached for the mattock again. The boy went, finally, his boots skidding once on the frozen lip of the cut before he found his footing and ran for the cabin, and she was alone again with the seam and the dark water and the particular silence of a mountain deciding whether to keep a secret or give it up. She worked the mattock into the loosened ground beside the first opening, widening it by degrees, the way her grandfather had shown her a man widens a door he does not yet trust, slow, listening at each stroke for the sound the earth made when it was ready to move, and the sound it made when it was only bracing to resist. The frost had glazed the exposed stone already, a thin skin forming where her breath and the day's small warmth had touched it, and she noted this the way he had taught her to note everything, filing it without yet knowing what use it would serve. Water that stood black like this, unmoving, was either dead water, cut off and stagnant, or it was water under pressure from somewhere else, held quiet only because it had not yet found its way. She pressed 2 fingers to the surface. It gave slightly, a give that trembled the length of the pool rather than staying local to her touch, and that trembling told her more than an hour of digging would have. Somewhere below or beside this cut, the water was still moving. It was being fed. She sat with that fact, the way she had learned to sit with facts before letting them become hope, turning it over, testing its underside for rot. The garden 200 feet below drew from a runnel that came out of the rock slide's western toe, a runnel she had traced back 3 separate times without ever finding its source, only losing it each time in a jumble of shattered granite, too heavy to move by hand. If this seam and that runnel shared a mother spring beneath the ice, it would mean the mountain had been generous in a way no one had thought to look for, hoarding its water underground the same season it buried a family in stone from above. It would mean the curse and the mercy had been lying in the same bed the whole time. The boy's mother came before the boy did, moving faster across the frozen yard than her thin coat and thinner boots should have allowed, the kettle swinging unlidded from one hand so that steam trailed behind her like a signal. She stopped at the lip of the cut and looked down, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there are discoveries that ask to be looked at in silence before they are named. Then the woman crouched, dipped 2 fingers into the black water as her son had, and drew them back slick and cold and trembling faintly, just as the girls had. "It's alive," she said, "not a question." "We won't know how alive," the girl answered, "until we follow it." She rose from her crouch and set the level on the flattest stone she could find, though nothing on that slope was truly flat, and everything her grandfather had taught her about patience came into her hands at once, steadying the brass, waiting for the bubble to settle before she trusted a single reading. The widow watched without asking what the instrument meant, though her eyes followed the small glass vial as if it were a living thing deciding something important. It settled. The girl read the grade running east from the granite jumble, then walked 12 paces and read it again, and a third time 20 paces further, marking each spot with a chip of slate pressed into the snow. The numbers did what numbers do when a mountain is finally willing to tell the truth about itself. They agreed with each other. 3 separate readings bending the same shallow degree toward the basin below, the same fall her grandfather had once traced with his finger across a table of dust in a kitchen she had not seen in over a year. "This isn't runoff," she said, half to the widow, half to the cold air. "Runoff argues with itself. This doesn't argue." The boy, who had followed his mother up with the same fearless unconcern he brought to everything, asked if that meant there was more water than the spring she'd already opened by the cabin, and she told him the truth, which was that she did not know yet. Only that a spring which fed 2 separate outlets 100 yards apart beneath solid rock was not a small vein. It was answering to something larger, sitting deeper in the mountain, patient and cold and unclaimed. She thought of the winter she had first climbed this slope, believing herself sent to a graveyard of acclaim, thought of the frozen crust that had told her nothing until she had learned to ask it the right questions, the way her grandfather asked questions of land that other men only looked at. The widow said little, but something in her posture had changed since morning, the exhaustion of the last 4 days, loosening slightly at the shoulders, as though the possibility of water running somewhere close to abundance had done what no meal or fire had managed. The girl gathered her level and her chips of slate and told them both to wait by the cabin, that she meant to follow the seam upward toward the granite jumble itself, because if the water was coming from above the slide and not merely pooling beneath it, then the whole shape of what she had inherited was different than she had understood it to be, larger, older, and far less accidental than a curse ought to be. She climbed with the level strapped across her back, the way her grandfather had once carried it, the brass warm against wool despite the cold, and she counted her steps out of old habit, the way he had taught her to count when the ground gave no other measure of itself. 40 paces brought her to the first outcrop of granite, gray and lichen-spotted, and she pressed her palm flat against it, the way she might press a hand to a horse's flank, to feel for fever, searching not for warmth, but for the faint vibration of water moving unseen beneath stone. She found it at 53 paces, a hum so slight she might have called it imagination if she had not spent 4 winters learning not to trust imagination over instrument. She set the level on a shelf of rock and sighted along its bubble toward the slide above, marking where the granite broke and where it did not, the way her grandfather had marked riverbanks in Ohio 30 years before either of them had seen a mountain. The line told her what her eyes alone could not, that the slope above the slide dropped in a shallow, deliberate grade toward a fold in the granite she had walked past a dozen times without seeing it as anything but rubble. She followed the grade upward, boots slipping on scree, breath turning to fog that hung and did not scatter in the windless cold. At the fold she stopped. A seam of ice ran through the rock there, thicker than the seam below, and beneath it, when she pressed her ear to the stone, the sound was no longer a hum, but something closer to a voice, steady, patient, unbroken by season. She thought of the word the freighters used, cursed, and thought how little that word had ever meant. how it was only what men called ground they had not troubled to measure. Her grandfather had never once called a piece of land cursed or blessed. He had only ever called it red or unread. She chipped at the ice with the flat of her hand axe until a sliver came away, and beneath it the rock was dark with moisture, dark in a way that spoke of months, perhaps years, of steady seepage rather than a single spring's thaw. She knelt there a long while, the level resting across her knees, and did the arithmetic her grandfather had drilled into her before she was old enough to understand why arithmetic mattered. Grade, distance, drop, the arithmetic of where water wants to go, and how a person might convince it to go somewhere more useful instead. By the time the light began to lean westward, she had already decided that what she had inherited was not a graveyard, not a curse, not even a claim in the ordinary sense. It was a reservoir the mountain had been keeping quietly to itself, waiting for someone patient enough to ask it the right questions. She did not rush the marking of it, though every part of her wanted to. Her grandfather had taught her that haste was the surest way to misread a slope, that a man who ran his level twice in a hurry would trust a number he ought to have doubted, and so she forced herself to move slow through the failing light, driving 3 stakes of split pine along the seepage line and sighting between them with the brass level until the bubble sat steady in its glass. 11 paces, then 19, then a place where the rock dropped away sharper than she expected, and she stood over that drop for a long while, chewing the inside of her cheek, before she understood what she was looking at was not a fault in the mountain, but a lip, a natural sill, the kind of shelf that water pools behind, before it decides where to spill. By the time true dark came down, she had eaten nothing since morning, and her hands had gone stiff with cold, but she sat by the fire with her grandfather's ledger open across her knees, and began sketching what she had found, the way he had shown her to sketch a survey. Not pretty, never pretty, just true, elevation marks. Distances paced and multiplied, a rough oval where she guessed the basin might lie beneath the ice and scree, fed by whatever vein ran down through the granite above. She did not yet know how deep the water sat, or how much of it there was, or whether a single hard freeze would seal it shut again before she could do anything useful with it. But she knew, in the way her grandfather had taught her to know things, through measurement, not through hope, that there was more here than a story told to frighten children away from a played-out claim. She banked the fire low and lay back against her bedroll with the level still cradled against her ribs, its brass gone cold as the night itself, and stared up at a sky gone hard and bright with stars in a way that made the mountain feel smaller than it had any right to feel. Somewhere below, miles off, a lamp burned in a cabin she had not yet seen, though she would come to know it well enough before winter closed the passes for good. Tomorrow she would need rope, and a second stake line run at right angles to the first, and daylight enough to trace the sill all the way to wherever it let the water go. Tonight there was only the arithmetic, turning over slow and patient in her mind, the way her grandfather had always said the mountain's true answer would come, not all at once, but one honest number at a time. Morning came gray and close, the clouds sitting low against the peaks like a lid set on a pot, and she woke stiff and cold with the level's brass edge printed faint against her ribs where she had held it through the night. She did not linger over breakfast. There was a second stake line to run, and she meant to have it down before the light changed and made the shadows lie to her the way they had the first week she'd spent up here, when she had misread a snowfield for solid ground and nearly paid for it with a broken ankle. She worked the rope out from the wagon box, coiled and stiff with cold, and paced off the right angle from her first stake the way her grandfather had shown her 100 times on flatter ground than this, heel to toe, counting under her breath, correcting for the slope with a patience that had nothing to do with hurry. The level went up on its tripod at the new mark, and she crouched behind it, one eye shut, and let the bubble find its own truth inside the glass. It told her what she had begun to suspect the evening before. The sill did not simply run along the base of the rock slide and stop, the way a dead spring might, its water long since swallowed by whatever collapse had buried it a generation past. It bent, it curved southward, following some old channel cut before the mountain had rearranged itself into rubble, and where it curved, the ground softened underfoot, in a way that had nothing to do with the frost still holding the rest of the slope hard as iron. She marked the bend with a second stake, then a third, walking the line out further than she had planned, until the stakes she had brought ran short, and she was cutting green willow to serve in their place, driving each one home with the flat of a rock because she had left the hammer below with the wagon. By the time the light began its early winter slide toward evening, she had traced the sill nearly 60 yards along the base of the slide, curving wide around a shoulder of broken granite, before disappearing beneath a drift too deep to dig with her hands. 60 yards of buried water, moving somewhere under all that stone, patient as anything her grandfather had ever taught her to respect. She stood a long while at the last stake, breath fogging, boots soaked through from kneeling in melt she had not noticed collecting around her, and did the arithmetic again in her head, not hope, only numbers, and found that the numbers, honest as always, gave her no reason at all to stop believing what the level had already told her twice. The cold had come down proper by the time she started back for the wagon, the kind of cold that made the snow squeak underfoot instead of hiss, and she counted her own footprints going out as a man counts coin, careful not to lose the tally. She did not sleep that night so much as lie still beside the fire with her eyes open, turning the days 60 yards over and over, matching them against the lines her grandfather had taught her to trust. Sight along the barrel of the level, the small bubble in its glass holding steady no matter how the ground beneath it lied. He had told her once, on a fence line outside Concordia, that water does not care what a man believes about it, it only obeys what is under it. She had been 11 years old and had not understood him. She understood him now, kneeling in the dark with her hands still raw from the willow stakes. By first light she had eaten nothing and did not care to. She took the level from its case, wrapped it again in the flannel that had once been her grandfather's shirt, and carried it up the slope the way another girl might carry a lamp into a cellar, not for warmth, but because without it, she would be walking blind. She set it at the last stake, sighted along the buried line where it vanished under the deep drift, and worked out, by the drop of the bubble and the slope of the shoulder above, where the water would have to surface if it surfaced at all, not where she wished it would, where the ground told her it must. The place it pointed to was a shelf of open ground below the granite shoulder, flat enough to hold a house, facing south enough to catch what little winter sun the mountain allowed. She had walked past it a dozen times already without seeing it as anything but a resting place to catch her breath. Now she stood on it with the level cradled against her chest, and felt the peculiar quiet of a fact settling into place. Not excitement, nothing so loud as that, only the same steady certainty her grandfather used to have when a fence came out true after 4 days of cursing and resetting stakes. She began digging that same afternoon, though the ground fought her the whole first foot, frozen hard enough to turn the shovel's edge, and she did not stop when her hands cracked at the knuckle, nor when the light failed early behind the ridge, because some part of her, patient as he had raised her to be, understood she was no longer guessing where the water was. She was only uncovering where it had been all along. By the third day of digging, she had opened a trench the length of her own body and half again, and the frost gave way beneath her to soil dark and damp in a way that no soil on that mountain had any right to be in the dead of January. She knelt and pressed her palm flat against it the way her grandfather used to press his palm against a plank before he trusted his weight to it, and she felt, faint as a pulse through a wrist, a coolness that was not the coolness of frozen ground, but of moving water somewhere beneath it, patient and untroubled by the season above. She sat back on her heels and did not move for a long while, only breathed, watching her breath cloud and vanish, and thought of him telling her once that water does not announce itself, it only waits to be asked correctly. She widened the trench the next morning, and the morning after that, working in the gray hour before full light, because the cold was easier to bear moving than standing still, and on the 5th day, her shovel struck something that was not stone and not frozen earth, but old wood, gray and swollen, laid crosswise beneath the soil like a lid, set deliberately over what it covered. She cleared the dirt from it with her hands, slow, the way she had been taught to clear dust from a marker stake so as not to gouge the wood beneath, and found planking fitted together with a care that no chance rockslide could have arranged. Someone, long before her, had built a cover over this ground, and meant it to be found again by someone who knew to look. She did not pry it open that day. She sat beside it instead, the level still in its case at her hip where it had ridden since morning, and looked out over the shelf of ground below the granite shoulder where she had already begun, in her mind, to lay furrows and terraces the way her grandfather had once laid them on paper for men who never built what he drew. The wind came down off the ridge the way it always did at that hour, carrying the smell of snow not yet fallen, and she pulled her coat tighter and thought, without any drama in the thought, only certainty, that whatever lay beneath that plank had been waiting a long time for someone patient enough to ask the ground the right question. Tomorrow, she told herself, tomorrow she would open it in daylight, with her hands steady, and see what the mountain had been keeping. A year turns slower on a mountain than anywhere else she had lived, and yet, looking back on it later, she would say it had gone by the way water goes through a sluice gate, steady, then suddenly, all at once. The plank came up easily the next morning, the nails long since given up to rust, and beneath it she found not a chamber or a strongbox, but something better suited to a place called Widow's Ice, a spring, cold and moving, walled in stone by hands that had understood exactly what they were protecting. Her grandfather had taught her to read slope and water, the way other men read scripture, and she stood over that hidden vein for a long while before she let herself believe what her own eyes were telling her, that the curse everyone spoke of had only ever been ignorance dressed up as fear, and that underneath the rockslide, the mountain had been quietly, patiently, keeping something alive. She did not tell the town at first. She only worked. Through the thaw, she cut the first terrace by hand, setting the level on its brass legs the way she had watched him do it 100 times as a girl, sighting along the bubble until the line held true, and she carried stone until her palms hardened past blistering. By midsummer the water ran where she told it to run, down through cut channels into beds of turned soil, and green came up out of ground that had not known a plow in longer than anyone could remember. It was in the first snow of the following winter that the widow arrived with her 3 children, half frozen and past pride, having heard only that there was a woman up on the cursed plot who somehow had food to spare. She fed them before she asked their names. That, she would think later, was the only decision in the whole year that had required no reading of slope or water at all. By the time the anniversary of her arrival came around, the terraces held through a second planting, and the cabin had a second stove, and the spring still ran the way it had run for who knew how many silent years before she'd thought to ask it a question. She mounted the level above the cabin door herself, the brass dulled but true, not as a relic, but as a plain fact for anyone passing to see. Proof that the ground had never been cursed, only unread, and that a girl with $11 and a dead man's patient teaching had simply been the first to look at it properly. She never called it luck. She called it, when anyone asked, the only inheritance that mattered. Not money, not land, but the eye to see what was already